So it's time to talk about Denis Arcand. Denis Arcand is one of the few Canadian directors who's probably known internationally. David Cronenberg, and I guess if you want to count Mike Myers as a director, are kind of the only other ones I can think of. But he's fairly well known, and his movies have won quite a few international awards. Which is interesting. Not only is he a Canadian director, but he's a Quebecois Canadian director who films his movies in French. So the fact that they have any success outside of Quebec is kind of fascinating. Besides that, his movies are very, very like culturally specific to Quebec, and I feel like anyone who's not from there wouldn't really fully get them. And someone who's not even Canadian would get them even less. Like as an Anglo Canadian, I can kind of get like portions of it, but it is a very different culture there. Anyways, so Denis Arcand is fairly well known. I've seen five of his movies. This is the fifth one. So the oldest movie I've seen of his, Jesus de Montreal, I can't even like. It's like about a guy who's gonna play Jesus in like the crucifixion, like play or something that takes place every year, like in the Nativity or something like that. I don't know, but he gets like crushed by the cross at the. It's a really bad movie. It's a really really bad movie. I don't recommend you watch it. It was unwatchable. And then we come to what he's probably better known for, the loose trilogy that consists of the decline of the American Empire, the Barbarian invasions, and Days of Darkness. And when we get into this, I don't know what Denis Arcand has said, like in interviews and stuff, about his political views, but they're very interesting. The focus, at least as far as I can determine, is it's kind of a lament for the end of the Quiet Revolution, the end of the sovereigntist movement, more or less, and a generation of Quebecers not really having any identity or purpose. Just to kind of, before we get into this, just to talk a little bit about Quebec. So historically, Quebec was the most conservative province. It was extremely Catholic. I think like 2% of women in Quebec were nuns at one point in time. Very religious. It was controlled by the Union Nationale for decades, which was a very conservative party. And then the Quiet Revolution came about, and I'm not gonna go into a ton of detail about that, but basically, the impression at least was that the church had been holding back education, particularly in science and business. And because of that, combined with other things, Anglos had really taken over the management positions at a lot of companies and were kind of making money. The other issue was the church in Quebec was extremely anti-labor. Um, so during the Quiet Revolution, the Union Nationale got overthrown. Sovereigntism became a really big thing, like not just Quebec being autonomous or maintaining its separate identity within Canada, but that Quebec should leave altogether and form its own country. And you kind of had Catholicism. I think it was called the evaporation or something, where over the span of a decade, mass attendance went from like 80% to like 15% over an extremely short span of time. So Quebec is now extremely secular and socially liberal, etc. So you kind of had that in the aftermath of the Quiet Revolution. You had this kind of rebirth of based civic nationalism. And then through a combination of probably, to be honest, vote rigging and various shenanigans, the referendum on independence failed by like a fraction of a percent. And the separatists have never really gotten the political power able to launch another referendum. And because of immigration and the younger generation not caring, at this point in time, it doesn't really look like Quebec will ever be an independent country. So you have a loss of Catholicism, you have a loss of a lot of the Quiet Revolution and the civic nationalism that kind of came afterwards. So modern Quebec, in my opinion at least, or just from what I've seen of it, is just basically a lot of it is just French people who don't like people who speak English. they've really like lost a lot of their traditional identity. It's weird though, just because since they speak French, which is a language that really isn't spoken much outside of Eastern Ontario and Quebec, they have kind of maintained their own society and culture, even if it's really just kind of lost its reason to exist, I guess. Hopefully, I'm making sense. Hopefully, some French Canadians can correct me in the comments. So, that being said, let's talk about his loose trilogy. The Decline of the American Empire, Barbarian Invasions, and Days of Darkness. So, the movies are loosely related. Barbarian Invasions is a sequel to Decline of the American Empire, and Days of Darkness is kind of unrelated. I think one character from one of the previous movies briefly appears in it. I don't know, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So, Decline of the American Empire isn't about the decline of the American Empire. I don't even think they go to America in it. It's basically a bunch of like pretentious intellectuals who, basically baby boomers, who grew up during the Quiet Revolution and the aftermath, and they just spend the whole movie sitting around and talking about sex, and like how many women they've banged and all the drugs they've done and all this kind of stuff. And basically everyone in the movie is just kind of a total degenerate. But I think that's kind of the point. Even though Denis Arcand, from my understanding, is a lapsed Catholic himself, it does seem to me, at least, that he is kind of bemoaning the fact that with the end of the sovereigntist movement and the end of Catholicism, that's basically all Quebec's been reduced to. It's just a bunch of people screwing constantly. And we get some classy lines like, "There were rivers of cum that would explain the rise in the St. Lawrence," and stuff like that. So it's a very, very self-indulgent movie that just goes on for like 2 hours of just people talking about sex in really graphic ways. It's not the worst we've ever seen. It's not very good. Then we get to the Barbarian Invasions, which was created as a response to 9/11. It's like in the trailer, there's like, it shows the 9/11 plane happening, and that happens also within the movie, the plane hitting the World Trade Center. So the title "The Barbarian Invasions" refers to the idea that there's always like a starting event before like barbarians invade and they settle. So like there's a scene where there's this pretentious Quebec professor named Alain Lucier who, talking about 9/11, says this may, and I stress may, be seen as the beginning of the great barbarian invasions. So like in that context, it's like that's kind of Islam's firing shot over the bow, and there's just going to be more and more coming. And later on in it, I think a police officer says something like, first it was the barbarians, we can't stop them. First it was the Haitians, then it was the Syrians, then it was the Vietnamese. And soon we will be overcome. There definitely tends to be a fairly strong anti-immigration message in most of Arcand's movies. Either that they just seem to cause most of the organized crime in Quebec, or just general societal disruption, which is kind of interesting, which is a fairly common thing. French Canadians, generally speaking, don't like immigration, and they tend to be more openly xenophobic, especially towards white English-speaking people. But they also tend to be extremely socially liberal on sexual issues. So the Barbarian Invasions is the main character of the previous movie is dying of cancer, and it's just more like him reflecting on his life, and it's just kind of showing like kind of what a waste of space he was, how his generation didn't attain any of the things they wanted. Like he goes to a hospital and it looks like hell, and it's just it's just kind of to show that generation, I think, kind of failed to achieve anything, and the younger generation just like his son's just like, okay, boomer, and that sort of thing. So the Barbarian Invasions refers to that. Does it really have anything directly to do with 9/11 other than the fact that they showed um, a clip of 9/11 in it, and the trailer said the events that invade our lives to try and link it? No, it really had nothing to do with it. And then there's Days of Darkness, which I won't really go into, which is once again just another kind of existentialist movie about like a guy who's like an incel. Um, yeah, Days of Darkness was not bad though. I mean, they're all very self indulgent, long, and kind of boring. Um, so I don't think I'd really recommend watching any of them unless you're just curious. I wound up watching them largely because of the name.